Georgia, 1988. The sun was sinking low over Ware County, painting the dirt roads in burnt orange and shadows. The air was thick, humid, heavy, alive with cicadas. In the distance, pine trees swayed and whispered as though they knew a secret. And on the shoulder of a lonely country road, something sat that did not belong. An old television console, its wood casing chipped, its screen gone. To most it looked like trash. But inside, hidden in its hollow shell, was a nightmare that would haunt this county for decades. As we open this case file together, remember to like and subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, so stories like this are never forgotten. It was a passerby who first noticed. A man driving home slowed as the strange angle of the console caught his eye. He pulled over, the tires of his truck crunching over gravel. The smell hit him before he touched it, sharp, sour, unnatural. When he leaned closer, his breath caught. Inside, crammed into the dark cavity, was the small form of a child. He stumbled back, panic surging. Moments later, red and blue lights washed the roadside, casting long shadows over the dirt. Detective Samuel Wright, one of the first on scene, never forgot what he saw. "I knew the second I looked inside," he would later recall. "Somebody wanted her erased." The child was tiny, no more than 5 or 6. Her hair was tangled, her clothes torn. No backpack, no toy, no sign of who she was or who she belonged to. No missing persons report matched her description. No frantic family stepped forward to claim her. She was, to the world, nobody. Fear spread through the small Georgia community like wildfire. Parents called their children in from yards. At the church down the road, whispers replaced hymns. Mothers glanced at their daughters during Sunday service and tightened their grip on small hands. Neighbors phoned each other, voices trembling. "Did you hear? They found a little girl in a TV. Who was she? Nobody knows." The newspapers carried only fragments, "Unidentified child found in console." Authorities seek clues. The silence around her name became heavier than the summer air. In the absence of answers, she was reduced to a placeholder, TV console Jane Doe. A label that stripped her humanity, reducing her to the object that concealed her. She was no longer a daughter, a neighbor, a child with laughter and fears. She was a mystery, sealed in wood and silence. Detective Wright kept a photo of the console pinned above his desk. He said it wasn't the body that haunted him most, it was the emptiness around her. It was like she didn't exist, he admitted. But she did exist. She had a name. She had a family. She had a short, stolen life. Her name was Kenyatta Odom. Kenyatta was 5 years old in 1988. She loved peanut butter sandwiches cut into triangles. She carried a stuffed rabbit to bed every night, its ears worn from being clutched so tightly. She hummed little songs to herself when she colored in her books, crayons scattered across the floor. She was a child who should have been starting kindergarten, running barefoot through the grass, learning to write her name. But that trust, the trust every child deserves, was broken. And the betrayal came from the place where she should have been safest, her own home. Her disappearance was never reported. No Amber Alert. No missing child poster taped to a grocery store wall. No desperate plea on the evening news. The silence around Kenyatta was not just absence. It was indifference, a deliberate forgetting. And for 34 years, that silence buried her deeper than the console itself. Tonight, we open her file. We trace the lines from a lonely dirt road in Georgia, through decades of neglect, to the courtroom where her truth was finally spoken. We give Kenyatta back what was stolen first, her name. But in 1988, investigators had only shadows to chase. And the trail, already faint, was about to grow colder. The dirt road where the console was found became more than just a stretch of gravel and weeds. 4 days, it was a stage, yellow tape fluttering in the heavy Georgia breeze, deputies standing guard, photographers clicking frame after frame. The console itself sat in the center like an unwilling exhibit, its secrets already exposed but still withholding answers. Detective Samuel Wright crouched near it, his notebook open but his mind heavy. He had worked cases before, robberies, domestic disputes, even a homicide or two. But this was different. This was a child. Every investigator knows that a child victim casts a longer shadow. The horror lingers not just in the evidence, but in the questions it raises about innocence, trust, and betrayal. And here was betrayal in its most cruel form. The small body was carefully removed and transported to the county coroner's office. Technicians in gloves worked quietly, their faces grim, their movements deliberate. The examination confirmed what was already clear. The victim was a girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old. Her bones were fragile, her clothing worn. Time and concealment had blurred details, but the violence was undeniable. Yet no one had reported her missing. No school had called. No relative had sounded the alarm. It was as if she had been erased from the world before anyone even knew she was gone. Investigators fanned out across the area. Deputies went door to door, asking neighbors if they knew of a missing child. Some shook their heads in confusion. Others looked away too quickly, unsettled by the thought that a killer might be nearby. One mother clutched her daughter to her side as she spoke to the deputy at her doorstep. "All I know is I'm not letting her out of my sight," she whispered, her voice trembling. At the local church that Sunday, the preacher asked for prayers for the little one without a name. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. But still no one came forward. And yet, a few whispered recollections lingered on front porches and in kitchen conversations. One neighbor remembered seeing a little black girl skipping rope outside a small house not far from the main road. Another swore they'd once heard laughter drifting across a fence. A high, clear giggle that stopped suddenly when an adult's voice barked her name. But none of those memories were ever written into police reports. Without certainty, they faded like smoke. Without an identity, the investigation had little to anchor itself to. Detective Wright stared at the evidence laid out on the table. Fragments of fabric, hair fibers, the wooden console itself. He knew each piece told part of a story, but the technology of 1988 was limited. DNA testing existed, but only in its infancy. Matches required known samples. And with no one claiming the child, there was nothing to compare it to. Frustration grew. Leads fizzled out. Some investigators wondered aloud if the girl had been brought from outside the county, her body dumped here because no one would recognize her. Others whispered darker theories. Maybe she came from a family who didn't want her found. It was a possibility they couldn't ignore. In homes across Ware County, fear turned into suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other with unease. Whose child had disappeared without anyone noticing? Who could have hidden such a crime in plain sight? And beneath those questions, an uglier thought began to stir. Had this little girl been white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, would she still be a Jane Doe? Would television crews have swarmed the county? Would her face have appeared on milk cartons, her name repeated until the nation demanded answers? But Kenyatta Odom's name was not spoken. Her picture was not broadcast. Her story was reduced to a footnote in local news. The investigators turned their eyes toward families on the margins. Those struggling, those less visible, those whose children might slip through the cracks without notice. Among them was Angela Morris and her boyfriend, Derek Hayes. The couple lived quietly in a modest rental with paint peeling from the shutters. Neighbors remembered Angela often looking tired, with a small girl clinging to her hip as she walked to the corner store. Derek, in contrast, was more visible, quick to laugh with friends, quicker still to anger if the mood shifted. Arguments behind their thin walls were not uncommon, and Angela's silences afterward were even more telling. But no official connection could be made. When deputies asked about the girl in the console, there was denial, confusion, nothing to tie them directly. And with no report of a missing child, no DNA profile, and no witness willing to step forward, suspicion dissolved back into the hot Georgia air. Detective Wright felt the weight of defeat pressing in. Each night, he drove home past fields that looked endless in the fading light. He thought about the child in the console, how small she had been, how utterly alone. He thought about his own children asleep in their beds, tucked in with stuffed animals and bedtime stories. Why hadn't anyone loved this little girl enough to fight for her? The case remained open, but leads dwindled. The console was stored as evidence. Photographs were filed. Reports stacked up, each one ending with the same phrase, "No further progress." It was as if the dirt road itself had swallowed her story. In the community, time dulled the shock but not the unease. People stopped talking about the case openly, but the memory lingered. Parents told their children not to wander far. Teachers watched their classrooms with a sharper eye. Still, the girl had no name. And without a name, she became easier to forget. But for a handful of investigators, she was never forgotten. Detective Wright, now older, kept her case file close. He told younger deputies about her, warning them of the cruelty people were capable of. "She's still out there," he would say, tapping the file. "Somewhere someone knows who she is. And one day we'll find out." But in 1988, that day felt impossibly far away. The crime scene was sealed, the evidence boxed away. And the little girl in the console, Kenyatta Odom, though no one yet knew her name, remained a ghost. A ghost with no voice, no advocate, no justice. Her story would drift into the cold years, waiting for the world to catch up. Time has a way of reshaping tragedy. What begins as a sharp wound slowly hardens into scar tissue. Visible, yes, but less spoken of. For Kenyatta Odom, the years that followed her death were perhaps the cruelest part of all. The summer heat that once carried whispers of a nameless girl faded into autumn, then winter. The dirt road where her body had been found grew over with weeds. The console was no longer there. It sat in an evidence locker, cataloged and boxed, its wooden frame carrying secrets no one could unlock. And life, as it always does, went on. In Ware County, parents who had once gripped their children tighter began to loosen their hold. The Sunday sermons about the little girl with no name gave way to newer concerns. A drought, the economy, local elections. The girl without a name faded from memory, for most. But not for Angela Carter, Kenyatta's mother. She lived with the absence every single day. Each morning when she folded laundry, there was one small shirt missing from the pile. Each evening when she set the table, she found herself hesitating before placing down only 3 plates instead of 4. She knew what the town didn't. She knew the child in the console had been her daughter. But in 1988, she had been too afraid to speak. Angela was trapped in a home defined by Derek Hayes' temper. He controlled the money, the decisions, and too often her silence. When Kenyatta went missing, Angela's world had already been battered into submission. Once, weeks after Kenyatta's disappearance, Angela tried to ask Derek if they should go to the police. His response was swift, the slam of his hand against the kitchen counter, the narrowing of his eyes, and the quiet, dangerous words, "Don't you dare." She swallowed her fear and stayed quiet. And so she carried her grief alone, hidden in plain sight. For Kenyatta's extended family, the years were marked by unanswered questions. Cousins asked why she never came to Christmas. Aunties whispered about Angela's distance. Grandmothers prayed in private, asking God to reveal what had been hidden. But in families like theirs, where survival often meant not drawing attention, silence became its own kind of inheritance. Detective Samuel Wright also carried the weight. He had moved on to other cases, burglaries, assaults, even homicides that had answers. But every so often, he would find himself back in the evidence room, pulling the slim brown folder from the shelf. Inside were photographs of the console, a diagram of the dirt road, the coroner's report, and tucked near the back, a list of possible leads that had long gone cold. He kept it close not because the case demanded it, officially it was stalled, but because he couldn't bear the idea of forgetting. "She's still out there," he told younger detectives. "Somebody knows her name. Somebody knows the truth." They nodded respectfully, though most believed the case would never be solved. In the community, the memory of the girl lingered in strange, fleeting ways. Children who had been told to stay close to home in 1988 grew into teenagers, then adults, carrying with them a half-remembered story of the little girl they found. Some recalled being pulled off swing sets by worried mothers. Others remembered sitting in church pews as prayers were said for a child no one claimed. By the early 2000s, one young woman told a friend in passing, "My mama never let me walk home alone, 'cause of that girl in the console." For her, it was more cautionary tale than lived memory. The details were blurry, but the fear had been passed down like folklore. Still, no one remembered her name, because no one had spoken it aloud. The cold years were hardest on Angela. Every birthday that passed was like reopening a wound. Kenyatta would have been 7, then 10, then a teenager. Angela imagined what her laughter might have sounded like as she grew older. She wondered what color dress she would have wanted for prom. She pictured her walking across a graduation stage, diploma in hand, ready to step into a future she'd never be given. Instead, all Angela had were memories. The way Kenyatta liked peanut butter sandwiches with too much jelly. The way she refused to go to sleep without clutching her stuffed rabbit. The way she once tried to sing louder than the choir at church, her little voice cracking on the high notes but carrying joy all the same. Memories became both comfort and torment, proof of a life, but reminders of its loss. As the 1990s arrived, technology and law enforcement began to change. DNA evidence was improving, and whispers of something called forensic genealogy started making their way into investigative circles. But in Ware County, budgets were thin and priorities were elsewhere. The girl in the console, still Jane Doe, wasn't seen as a case that would move the needle. Had she been white, maybe her story would have been revived on nightly news broadcasts or featured in a national magazine. But as a young black girl from a quiet corner of Georgia, she was largely invisible. This invisibility was not new. Across the country, families of missing black women and girls often faced indifference, their pleas met with silence, their cases left untouched. Kenyatta became one more name in a long list of those forgotten. Yet she was not forgotten by everyone. Detective Wright retired in the late 90s, his hair grayer, his hands slower, but the file still haunted him. Before he left, he made sure it was placed in the cold case cabinet, not simply archived. It was his way of keeping her present, a reminder to those who came after him that justice was still owed. And in a way, he passed the burden along. The cold years were not just about silence, they were about endurance. For Angela, endurance meant living under Derek's shadow, carrying the unspoken truth that her child had been taken from her. For the wider family, endurance meant keeping questions locked in their throats, afraid of answers they already suspected. For the community, endurance meant carrying a ghost story that no one wanted to revisit. And for Kenyatta herself, though gone, endurance meant waiting. Waiting for signs to catch up. Waiting for someone to care enough to reopen her file. Waiting for her name to be spoken again. By the early 2000s, her case was rarely mentioned even inside the sheriff's office. New crimes demanded attention. Old ones faded further into obscurity. The file sat untouched on its shelf, dust collecting along the edges. But every so often, when the evidence room door opened, a draft would stir the papers, as if reminding whoever stood there that something was unresolved. Unresolved, but not unsolvable. It would take decades before her name was restored, before justice inched closer. But for now, in the long stretch of years between 1988 and the future, Kenyatta Odom existed only in fragments. A console in an evidence locker, photographs in a folder, memories tucked into her mother's aching heart. The world had moved forward. But the truth had stayed behind, waiting for science to unlock it. For nearly 3 decades, the file sat in the cold case cabinet at the Bay County Sheriff's Office. A slim folder, its edges worn, its label faded. To most deputies who passed by, it was one forgotten case among many. But for those who had once touched it, Detective Samuel Wright most of all, it was unfinished business, a question that demanded an answer. And then the world caught up. By 2018, forensic science had leapt forward. DNA testing was no longer experimental, it was transformative. Across the country, cases once considered unsolvable were cracking open. The Golden State Killer had been unmasked that very year, his identity traced through genetic genealogy. National headlines declared it a new age for justice. At the Bay County Sheriff's Office, Detective Carla Henderson read those headlines with interest. She was a mother of 2, raising children of her own, when she pulled the faded folder from the cold case cabinet. She opened it slowly as though disturbing something fragile. Inside were yellowed photographs of the console, the coroner's report, hand-typed notes. What struck her wasn't just the brutality of the case, but the emptiness. A child without a name, a life without recognition. Who was she? Henderson whispered aloud in the quiet evidence room. Somebody's daughter. Somebody's everything. Henderson took the folder to her captain. "Can we test the DNA?" she asked. The evidence box was retrieved from storage. Inside were the artifacts preserved since 1988. Fibers from the console, bone fragments, swabs sealed in vials. They had been waiting untouched through decades of neglect. The samples were sent to a modern lab. Weeks later, results came back. The Jane Doe was no Jane Doe. She was Kenyatta Odom. Forensic genealogy traced a match through distant relatives who had submitted DNA to ancestry databases. Cross-referencing with missing persons reports confirmed it. After 30 years, her name was restored. For Angela Carter, the call came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She was standing in her kitchen, pouring coffee, when the phone rang. "Mrs. Carter," a voice said, "we believe we've identified your daughter." Angela's hand shook so hard the cup nearly slipped. For a moment she could not breathe. Decades of waiting, praying, and fearing had collapsed into this single sentence. Her first words were a whisper, "You found her?" Detective Henderson explained the DNA match, the genealogy work, the confirmation. Then she asked the question Angela had dreaded for 34 years. "Can you tell us about Kenyatta's last day?" Angela began slowly. She described the summer of 1988, the weight of Derek Hayes' control, the fear that kept her silent. She admitted she hadn't gone to police, too terrified of what Derek might do. Tears blurred her words as she spoke of Kenyatta's laughter, her stubborn streak, her love for that worn-out stuffed rabbit. But woven into the grief was something heavier, shame. "I should have protected her," Angela whispered. "I should have fought harder. I stayed quiet and she paid the price." Detective Henderson leaned forward gently. "Mrs. Carter, you did the best you could under impossible circumstances. This was not your fault." But Angela shook her head. She had carried the guilt for decades. Naming it didn't lift it, but it made the silence less crushing. And she spoke her daughter's name again and again as if trying to breathe her back into the world. "Kenyatta, my Kenyatta." As detectives dug deeper, Derek Hayes emerged as the central figure. In 1988, he had told investigators Kenyatta was visiting relatives. No one had pressed harder. But now, Angela's account painted a different picture. And so did the memories of others. One cousin recalled family gatherings where Kenyatta would edge away from Derek, hiding behind Angela's legs whenever he entered the room. She was just a little girl, the cousin said, but she knew when to be quiet around him. Too quiet. Another family member admitted, "We always felt something wasn't right. But back then we didn't know how to say it out loud." Police records revealed a trail of domestic incidents, none leading to serious charges, but enough to show a pattern of control and rage. Detectives also revisited the scene. The dirt road where the console had been left was overgrown, but Henderson and her team returned with modern tools: cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, forensic cameras. They found no new evidence, but their presence alone was symbolic. It meant we have not forgotten. Meanwhile, word spread quickly. Local media reported. DNA breakthrough reopens 1988 cold case of young Georgia girl. Jane Doe identified after 30 years. For the first time, Kenyatta's name appeared in bold print. The community reacted with shock and sorrow. One longtime resident told a reporter, "I always wondered about that little girl they found. We never knew who she was. Now we do. God rest her soul." Online, people across the country echoed the outrage. Many pointed out what had been missing for decades, that Kenyatta, as a black child, had been invisible in national coverage. Her case was not an exception but part of a painful pattern. This time, her invisibility became part of the story. What do you think? Does justice delayed still feel like justice delivered? Let us know in the comments. The case was no longer about a nameless child. It was about a little girl with a family, a community, and a truth waiting to be told. And the truth was pointing straight at Derek Hayes. Detectives located him 2 counties away. He was older now, grayer, living in a modest house with a new wife. To neighbors he seemed ordinary, quiet, reserved, polite. But when Henderson and her partner knocked on his door and spoke the name Kenyatta, something flickered in his eyes. Just for an instant. It was enough. They questioned him about that summer in 1988. Where was he the night Kenyatta disappeared? Why had he told investigators she was with relatives? Why hadn't he reported her missing himself? Derek's answers shifted. His stories contradicted earlier statements. He grew defensive, then evasive. And evidence began to tighten around him. DNA from the console fibers matched samples from his old truck. Angela's testimony detailed years of intimidation. Family accounts described his temper and Kenyatta's fear. Piece by piece the puzzle sharpened. The image was clear. Derek Hayes had silenced Kenyatta, and had hidden behind silence for 34 years. By the spring of 2022, detectives were ready. The sheriff's office prepared charges. The little girl in the console was no longer a Jane Doe. She was Kenyatta Odom. And the man who thought time would bury the truth was about to face it. But the question remained, after decades of silence, would a jury believe the case? The morning of Derek Hayes' arrest began like any other in his quiet neighborhood. Birds chirped from the oaks lining the street, sprinklers hissed across trimmed lawns, and the smell of coffee drifted from kitchen windows. But the calm was pierced by the sudden arrival of unmarked cars, their engines low and deliberate, their doors opening in near unison. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains as deputies approached Derek's modest home. The man inside, who had lived for decades as just another face in town, was about to have his double life exposed. The knock on the door was firm. When Derek opened it, he saw Detective Alicia Henderson standing there, her badge gleaming against her jacket, 2 deputies flanking her. Her expression carried the weight of 34 years. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice measured but heavy with finality, "you are under arrest for the murder of Kenyatta Odom." Time seemed to stall. Derek blinked once, twice, his mind scrambling for footing. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came. His shoulders slumped, his eyes darting toward the watching neighbors. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The sound was sharp, metallic, irreversible. As he was escorted down the steps, whispers rippled across the block. "Did she say murder?" one neighbor muttered. "After all these years?" said another. For some, the name Kenyatta Odom stirred faint memories, whispers of a tragedy from 1988, a girl gone missing, the unsolved story of a child never returned home. For others, it was the first time they were hearing the name at all. But for Angela Carter, watching the news unfold later that day, it was the moment her past and present collided. The man she had once loved, the man who had stolen her daughter, was finally in chains. The arrest made headlines across Georgia. Cold case breakthrough. Man arrested in 1988, murder of young girl. DNA links stepfather to decades-old crime. On social media, people shared scanned newspaper clippings from the 1980s, old grainy photographs of Kenyatta's missing person flyer, her wide smile staring back at a world that had once moved on without her. A retired pastor who had preached at her funeral spoke to reporters. "Back then, I had more questions than answers. I never thought I'd live to see this day. Now maybe her spirit can rest." The courtroom became a stage where past and present collided. Jury selection stretched over days, the defense probing each candidate. Could they truly weigh evidence from decades past? Did they understand the fallibility of memory? The prosecution countered with quiet confidence, reminding jurors that technology had given them something memories alone could not: DNA. By the time opening statements began, the courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back, sketch artists sharpened their pencils, and locals who remembered the whispers of 1988 filled the benches. At the front sat Angela, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. The prosecution's case was meticulous. They called forensic specialists who explained how fibers from Kenyatta's clothing had been preserved, and how modern DNA analysis tied them to Derek's truck. They reconstructed the timeline: Kenyatta's disappearance after an argument at home, Derek's inconsistent statements, the tragic discovery of her body along a dirt road. Family members testified. A cousin described how Kenyatta would shrink away from Derek's voice. A neighbor recalled late-night shouting from the Carter home, words muffled but the violence unmistakable. One aunt, her voice quivering, told the jury about seeing bruises on Kenyatta's arms. When she asked Angela, Angela had looked down, whispering, "She fell." The aunt had known it wasn't true. Piece by piece, the prosecution laid out a story not of a single moment of rage, but of a pattern: intimidation, silence, and finally, murder. The defense fought back hard. They brought in a forensic consultant who raised doubts about evidence handling in 1988. Fibers degrade. Samples can be contaminated. Can we be certain that what was collected then is truly reliable now? They questioned Angela's memory, suggesting her grief had blurred fact and suspicion. "Mrs. Carter," the defense attorney pressed, "isn't it true that no one ever saw Mr. Hayes harm Kenyatta? Isn't it possible that after years of heartbreak, you've convinced yourself he must be guilty?" Angela's voice trembled, but she did not break. "I convinced myself of nothing," she replied. "I lived it. I saw the fear in my daughter's eyes. I heard her cries through the walls. I knew. And now the evidence proves it." The jury watched closely, the weight of her words pressing into the silence. Angela's testimony was the heart of the trial. She described her life with Derek, the charm he showed in public, the control he demanded at home. She spoke of Kenyatta's stubborn streak, her laughter, her stuffed rabbit she refused to sleep without. Then she spoke of fear. How Kenyatta would sometimes hide behind her, refusing to go near Derek. How her daughter had once whispered, "Mama, I don't like him," but she hadn't known how to protect her. Angela broke down as she admitted her guilt. "I should have gone to the police. I should have taken her and left. But I was terrified of him. And now, I live every day knowing I failed my daughter." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Even jurors who had kept stone faces throughout shifted uncomfortably, their eyes moist. Derek's presence loomed over every moment. He sat rigid at the defense table, expression blank, but his body betrayed him. His jaw clenched when Kenyatta's name was spoken. His fingers tapped against the wood when photographs were shown. At one point, when the prosecution displayed Kenyatta's school photo, her bright eyes, her missing front tooth, Derek's composure cracked. He leaned back sharply, exhaling through his teeth. The sound drew a glance from the jury. The bailiff shifted closer, but Derek settled again, hands folded. The mask of calm returned, but the fissure had been seen. Closing arguments sealed the case. The prosecution's final words cut through the courtroom. "This is not about faded memories. This is not about speculation. This is about a little girl who never got to grow up. A little girl hidden in a console, hidden in silence, until DNA gave her back her name." Derek Hayes hid behind that silence for 34 years. But today the silence ends. Today you have the power to give Kenyatta the justice she has waited for. The defense countered, warning of convicting a man on decades-old shadows and emotions. But their words felt hollow against the mountain of evidence and testimony. The jury deliberated for hours. Outside, Angela sat in the hallway, clutching her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened. Family members paced. Reporters filled the corridors, their whispers echoing. Detective Henderson stood against the wall, silent, steady, a quiet guardian of the truth. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, the room froze. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict slip. A long silence stretched, a silence heavy with 34 years of waiting. Angela closed her eyes. On the charge of murder, guilty. The words detonated like thunder. Angela gasped, covering her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Family members clung to one another, sobbing, whispering prayers of thanks. In the gallery, strangers who had followed the trial for weeks bowed their heads in reverence. Derek sat motionless, staring straight ahead. His shoulders slumped. For the first time in his life, he had no control. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. The verdict spread quickly. National headlines framed it as a triumph of DNA and perseverance. But within Ware County, it meant something deeper. People who had grown up with the whispers of the little girl in the console now spoke her name with reverence. A pastor said during Sunday service, "Truth delayed is still truth. Justice delayed is still justice." Kenyatta Odom has been seen. For Angela, the verdict was both everything and not enough. "I waited my whole life for this," she told reporters, her voice breaking. "But justice doesn't erase the empty chair at my table. It doesn't erase the birthdays I missed. It doesn't bring back her laugh. Still, at least now the world knows her name. At least now she's not forgotten." Her words captured the paradox of justice in cold cases, victory shadowed by irreversible loss. Detective Henderson, when asked what the case meant, answered quietly, "It means silence didn't win. It means Kenyatta matters." For the community, the trial became a mirror. It reflected the cost of decades of silence, the dangers of invisibility, and the resilience of families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. And for Angela, it closed one chapter. Justice had been served, but grief remained. And the legacy of Kenyatta Odom was only just beginning. The courtroom was empty now. The echo of footsteps had faded, the air no longer humming with whispered speculation, sobs, or the clicking of journalists' keyboards. All that remained was silence, the same silence that had haunted Willow Creek for 34 years. For Angela Odom, that silence was both a comfort and a burden. She had walked out of the courthouse with her mother by her side, clutching her hand like she was still the child she had once been. Reporters called her name, asking how it felt to see justice finally done. But Angela hadn't answered. Her voice belonged somewhere else, at her sister's grave, at the spot where Kenyatta's life had been cut short. That night, Angela drove alone to the cemetery. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, just as it had on the night her sister vanished. She carried a bouquet of lilies, Kenyatta's favorite. Placing them at the headstone, she whispered, "They finally said your name, Kenyatta. Not just in our kitchen, not just in our memories. In court. In history. They can't erase you anymore." Her voice cracked, but she smiled through the tears. The verdict had given her something she had feared might never come: recognition that her sister mattered. For the Odom family, the trial was not an ending. It was the beginning of a long and uneven road toward healing. Evelyn, the matriarch, had carried her grief with quiet strength for decades. But in the months after Derek's conviction, she allowed herself moments she had never permitted before. She cooked Kenyatta's favorite dishes again, filling the kitchen with smells that once brought too much pain. She sang softly while folding laundry. She even allowed laughter, the kind that bubbles up unexpectedly, startling in its warmth. Angela wrestled with guilt. She replayed the years of silence, the moments she had doubted her instincts, the times she had wanted to push harder but hadn't. Therapy helped. So did the community groups she joined, organizations dedicated to supporting families of missing persons, especially those whose cases never made headlines. Yet not every relationship survived. Some relatives had defended Derek for years, insisting he could never harm Kenyatta. They had sat stone-faced during the trial, avoiding eye contact with Angela and Evelyn. After the verdict, phone calls went unanswered, holiday invitations unreturned. Justice had revealed not only the truth about Derek, but also the fault lines in a family's foundation. In Willow Creek, the case left its own complicated legacy. Older neighbors spoke in hushed voices about how they had doubted Evelyn back then. "We thought she was overreacting," one man admitted at the local diner. "We told her Kenyatta probably just ran off. Lord forgive us." At New Hope Baptist Church, where Kenyatta had once sung in the youth choir, the pastor devoted a sermon to her memory. "For too long," he said, "our sister's life was treated as disposable. But God does not forget his children even when the world does." Congregants wept openly. Some left flowers at the church steps afterward, a spontaneous memorial decades overdue. But not everyone welcomed the verdict. A former neighbor muttered to a reporter, "I still don't believe Derek did it. The police just wanted someone to blame. 30 years too late and now they ruin a man's life." His words were uncomfortable, a reminder that closure is rarely unanimous. The local paper, which had given Kenyatta's disappearance little coverage in 1988, ran a full-page retrospective after the verdict. The headline read, "Justice After 34 Years, Willow Creek Woman's Murder Solved." For the first time, Kenyatta's face, a smiling black teenager with bright eyes, was seen by thousands of readers. For the first time, she was not invisible. The case also ignited conversations beyond Willow Creek. Advocates pointed out that Kenyatta's case had languished partly because she was a young black woman in the rural South. Had she been white, had she been from a more affluent family, her disappearance would have been front-page news for weeks, one activist said. Instead, she was forgotten, except by her mother and sister. That neglect is systemic and it has to change. A 2020 report confirmed the disparity. Though black girls represented nearly 40% of all missing children in the U.S., they accounted for less than 20% of sustained media coverage. Kenyatta's story was now being cited in seminars and training sessions for law enforcement, urging investigators to examine their own biases. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation responded with reforms, citing the establishment of dedicated cold case units and partnerships with forensic genealogy experts. But advocates warned that real change would only come when society valued every missing child equally. For those who knew her best, Kenyatta's legacy was more than a case file. She was the sister who braided Angela's hair before school, laughing when her fingers got tangled. She was the daughter who left notes on the fridge, doodling hearts around her mother's shopping list. She was the teenager who dreamed of becoming a nurse, who loved dancing to Whitney Houston, who once rescued a stray cat and begged to keep it. At the unveiling of a new memorial bench in the town square, Angela spoke to a crowd of neighbors, journalists, and students who had never met Kenyatta. Her voice was steady. "My sister was more than her last day. She was joy. She was light. And for 34 years her name was almost erased. But today and every day forward we speak her name. We honor her not because of how she died, but because of how she lived." The crowd applauded, some weeping, some holding candles. The bench bore a simple inscription, "In memory of Kenyatta Odom, beloved daughter, sister, friend." The Cold Case Archive is about more than solving crimes. It's about preserving stories. And Kenyatta's story is a reminder that justice can come late, but it must come. That silence can be broken even after decades. That the lives of black women and girls matter, even when the world overlooks them. As Angela left the memorial that evening, she noticed the rain beginning to fall again. It reminded her of that night in 1988, the night Willow Creek first fell silent. But this time the rain felt different, not like an ending but like a cleansing. Kenyatta was no longer lost in the shadows of a forgotten case. She had been brought into the light, where she belonged all along. This has been the Cold Case Archive. Thank you for joining us as we preserve these stories one file at a time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that the memory of these cases lives on.